The rain came down in sheets over occupied Paris, October 1943. It hammered the cobblestones of the Rue de la Pompe with a violence that matched the times. In a fifth-floor apartment overlooking the street, a man sat perfectly still in the darkness, watching the entrance to Gestapo headquarters across the way. His name was William Grover Williams, though the Germans hunting him knew him only as Agent W. What they didn't know, what would have terrified them had they known, was that he was sitting less than 200 meters from their command post, cataloging every officer who entered and left. The cigarette between his fingers had gone cold an hour ago. He didn't dare light another. Through the rain-streaked window, he watched SS Sturmbannführer Hans Kiefer emerge from the building, flanked by two subordinates. Grover Williams committed their faces to memory. In 3 hours, this information would be in London. In 3 days, one of those men would be dead, killed by resistance fighters with intelligence so precise the Germans would spend weeks searching for the leak inside their own organization. They never suspected the Englishman who'd won the Monaco Grand Prix in 1929 and 1933. They never suspected the racing driver who spoke perfect French and had lived in Paris for 15 years. They never suspected that one of their most devastating intelligence failures was happening in plain sight, orchestrated by a man who moved through occupied France like a ghost. This is the story of the spy the Nazis never caught, not because they didn't try, but because he understood something fundamental that many agents never learned. The best place to hide is often in full view, and the most dangerous weapon in espionage isn't a gun or a radio, but patience measured in heartbeats while the enemy walks past your hiding place. William Grover Williams was an unlikely candidate for espionage. Born in 1903 to an English father and French mother, he'd grown up between two worlds, a duality that would later prove invaluable. By the 1930s, he was one of Europe's most celebrated racing drivers, a man who'd pushed Bugattis to their mechanical limits on circuits from Monaco to Le Mans. He was wealthy, charming, fluent in French and English, and possessed of that peculiar courage that allows a man to hurtle toward a corner at 120 miles per hour, trusting in reflexes and judgment when the margin between survival and catastrophe is measured in fractions of a second. In 1939, as Europe collapsed toward war, these weren't the typical qualifications for a spy, but they were exactly what the newly formed Special Operations Executive was looking for. The SOE, Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, wasn't interested in gentleman spies playing at espionage in the John Buchan tradition. They needed operatives who could function behind enemy lines for months or years, who could blend in to occupied populations, who possessed technical skills, unshakable nerve, and the capacity for violence when required. Grover Williams's racing career had taught him mechanical expertise, split-second decision-making under pressure, and perhaps most importantly, how to read terrain at speed, skills that translated directly to escape and evasion. But there was something else. Major Maurice Buckmaster, head of SOE's French section, recognized in Grover Williams a quality harder to define: the ability to compartmentalize risk. A racing driver accepts that death is statistically probable, but proceeds as if it's impossible. This psychological trick, acknowledging danger while refusing to be paralyzed by it, was exactly the mindset SOE needed in occupied France. He had a rather peculiar talent, one SOE training officer noted in a declassified assessment. He could sit in a room with German officers, share a drink, discuss racing, and all the while he was counting them, noting their ranks, memorizing their faces. He treated intelligence gathering like a race, meticulous preparation, then flawless execution when the moment came. No hesitation, no second-guessing. In the spring of 1940, as France fell, Grover Williams evacuated to England. He could have sat out the war in comfort, a celebrity exile, dining in London restaurants while writing his memoirs. Instead, he volunteered for SOE. In November 1940, after intensive training in demolitions, tradecraft, codes, and silent killing, he was given the code name Sebastian and assigned to Operation Clergyman, one of SOE's earliest infiltration missions into occupied France. The operational objective seemed straightforward: establish a network in the Paris region, recruit resistance cells, gather intelligence on German military movements, and prepare for sabotage operations against strategic targets. The reality was far more complex. Grover Williams would be operating in the heart of Nazi power, in a city crawling with Gestapo, SS intelligence, and French collaborators. The average life expectancy for an SOE agent in France was 6 months. Grover Williams would last 4 years. The Lysander that carried Grover Williams back to France descended through the darkness on the night of May 31, 1941. The pilot brought the aircraft in low over the Loire Valley, navigating by moonlight and dead reckoning, searching for the torch signals that marked the drop zone. In the cramped passenger compartment, Grover Williams checked his papers one final time. His cover identity was perfect: a French businessman with legitimate documentation, a plausible backstory, and connections that could be verified if investigated superficially, but not too deeply. The aircraft touched down in a pasture, bounced once, and rolled to a stop. Grover Williams had less than 90 seconds. He grabbed his case, containing a radio set disguised as a suitcase, emergency funds in French francs, and a suicide pill sewn into his jacket lining, and dropped into the night. Behind him, the engine of the Lysander roared as it accelerated back down the improvised runway. By the time German radar might have detected it, the aircraft was already 20 miles away, hedge-hopping back toward England. Grover Williams stood alone in the French darkness. The resistance cell that was supposed to meet him wasn't there. Compromise, confusion, or simply the chaos of occupation. It was the kind of failure that killed agents in their first hours. But Grover Williams had one enormous advantage. He knew this country intimately. He'd raced on these roads, dined in these villages, navigated these landscapes at 100 miles per hour. Now he would navigate them at walking pace, invisible. He made his way to Paris on foot and by train, traveling by day, dressed like a businessman, carrying his deadly cargo in plain sight. At checkpoints, he responded to German soldiers in polite, accented French. Not too perfect, which would arouse suspicion, but competent enough to avoid problems. The key to effective cover, SOE had taught him, wasn't elaborate deception. It was boring consistency. Be forgettable. Be slightly tedious. Make the guard want to wave you through just to end the interaction. It worked.
Within a week, Grover Williams had established himself in Paris, reconnected with his pre-war social circle, French friends who had no idea he was British intelligence, and begun building his network. His cover was extraordinarily effective because it was almost entirely real. He was a racing driver who'd lived in Paris for years. He did have connections throughout French automotive and social circles. The only difference was that now every conversation was an intelligence-gathering opportunity. The best legends are built on truth, an SOE instructor had told him. Invent as little as possible. The more real your cover, the fewer lies you have to remember. Grover Williams took this to its logical extreme. He socialized, he attended dinners, he was seen at restaurants where German officers dined. He discussed racing with Wehrmacht colonels who'd been motorsport enthusiasts before the war. And all the while, he was watching, listening, cataloging. Which units were stationed where? Which officers seemed competent and which were fools? How troop morale shifted? What supplies were moving through Paris rail yards? Where the vulnerabilities were? The intelligence flowed back to London in coded radio transmissions, sent during brief windows when German direction-finding units couldn't triangulate his position before he shut down and moved. SOE's radio operators in France had a life expectancy measured in weeks. The Gestapo's Funkspiel, radio game, detection units were devastatingly effective. But Grover Williams was careful, disciplined, and lucky. He transmitted rarely, kept messages short, and never used the same location twice. By late 1941, the network he'd built, codenamed Chestnut, was providing some of the most valuable intelligence coming out of occupied France. To understand what Grover Williams accomplished, you have to understand the psychological toll of long-term deep cover operations. Modern intelligence agencies recognize this now. They have psychological support systems, rotation schedules, extraction protocols. In 1941, SOE agents were simply expected to endure. Every conversation was a performance. Every social interaction carried the risk of exposure. A slip in accent, a reference that didn't fit the cover story. A moment of inattention when someone mentioned something about England and he reacted instinctively. The Gestapo were experts at detecting these microtells, hesitations, eye movements, inconsistencies in stories told weeks apart. Captain Hans Kiefer, who ran Gestapo counterintelligence operations in France, was particularly skilled at this. His interrogation technique involved building rapport over days or weeks, creating a false sense of safety, then introducing contradictions so subtle the subject didn't realize they'd been caught until the trap had already closed. Kiefer's unit captured dozens of Allied agents. They broke the most of them, not through torture, though they used that too, but through psychological manipulation, exhaustion, and the exploitation of tiny mistakes. Grover Williams avoided these traps through an almost superhuman discipline. His racing career had taught him to maintain absolute focus during extended periods of stress, 3-hour races where a single lapse of concentration could be fatal. Now he applied that same focus to his cover identity, maintaining it so consistently that it became real even to himself. Friends from before the war noticed no change. He was still Williams, the charming English-French racing driver, now stuck in Paris during the occupation, making the best of things. But at night, alone in his apartment, the mask came off. In his debriefing after the war, other SOE agents who'd worked with him reported that Grover Williams suffered from severe insomnia and what we'd now recognize as symptoms of chronic stress and hypervigilance. He couldn't maintain the covert even in sleep. He'd wake at the slightest sound, convinced the Gestapo had found him. One of his radio operators, Robert Benoit, another former racing driver recruited into SOE, later described the psychological state. You live in two realities simultaneously. In one, you're having lunch and discussing wine. In the other, you're calculating how quickly you could reach your suicide pill if the Germans burst in. After months of this, you start to lose track of which reality is real. The human mind isn't designed to sustain that kind of divided consciousness. Yet, Grover Williams sustained it for years. By late 1941, Chestnut had expanded dramatically. Grover Williams had recruited a network that spanned from Paris to the Atlantic coast, including several former racing drivers and mechanics whose technical expertise made them invaluable for sabotage operations. Robert Benoit, Jean-Pierre Wimillet, and William Charles Frederick Grover, no relation but the shared name caused endless confusion in SOE communications, all joined the network. Their most significant operation came in the spring of 1943, Operation Clergyman Phase 2, a coordinated sabotage campaign targeting the French rail network that supplied German forces in Normandy and Brittany. The operation required extraordinary precision. Hit too many targets, and the Germans would lock down the entire region, making future operations impossible. Hit too few, and the strategic impact would be negligible. Grover Williams coordinated attacks on 12 separate targets across a 6-day period in May 1943. Rail junctions were destroyed using plastic explosives delivered by RAF drops. Signal boxes were sabotaged using delayed action devices that detonated hours after the saboteurs had left. Telegraph lines were cut at carefully chosen points that maximized disruption while making it look like random resistance activity rather than a coordinated intelligence operation. The damage assessment, compiled from German records after the war, showed the operation delayed troop movements by an average of 72 hours across the entire region, a tactical setback that proved strategically significant when the Allies invaded Normandy 13 months later. But success brought danger.
The Gestapo's counterintelligence units had been tracking the increase in sabotage activity. They knew a sophisticated network was operating in the Paris region. What they didn't know was who was running it. Kiefer initiated Operation Donar, a sweep designed to capture or eliminate the network's leadership. The Germans' methodology was systematic and terrifying. They started with mass arrests of known resistance sympathizers, using torture and threats against families to extract information. Most resistance members knew only their immediate contacts. The cell structure was designed to limit exposure if someone broke under interrogation. But the Germans were patient. They arrested 50 people to get 5 names. They interrogated those 5 to get 2 more. Slowly, methodically, they mapped the network. In March 1943, they got a break. A resistance courier named Marcel Rousset was captured at a checkpoint outside Paris, carrying coded messages that linked him to Chestnut. Rousset was tough. He'd survived 3 days of Gestapo interrogation without revealing anything significant. But on the 4th day, Kiefer tried something different. He brought Rousset better food, offered him cigarettes, and spoke to him not as an interrogator, but as a fellow soldier caught in a terrible war. "You're a brave man," Kiefer told him, speaking in careful French. "You've endured what most men couldn't. I respect that. But this is finished now. We have your entire network. We know about the Englishmen. We know about the racing drivers. What I'm offering you is simple. Cooperate, and you'll be treated as a prisoner of war when this ends. Refuse, and you'll be executed as a terrorist. Not today, I'm not threatening you. But when Germany wins this war, and we will win it, there will be no mercy for terrorists." It was a masterful manipulation. Acknowledgement of courage, a false claim of complete knowledge, Kiefer actually knew very little, and a threat disguised as pragmatic advice. Most importantly, it exploited exhaustion and despair. Rousset broke. Not completely. He revealed only 2 names, both of what he believed to be lower-level operatives, but one of those names led to another, and that lead led to a radio operator's safe house in the 14th arrondissement. On March 18, 1943, the Gestapo raided the safe house. They found a radio set, codebooks, and documentation linking the operation to London. What they didn't find was the network's leadership. Grover Williams, warned by an alert from a resistance member who'd observed German surveillance activity, had already disappeared. For the next 6 months, he operated in what SOE called black status, completely isolated, with no radio contact, relying on emergency procedures and prearranged dead drops to communicate. It was extraordinarily dangerous. Without radio contact, London couldn't warn him of compromised operatives or changing situations. He was entirely on his own. During this period, Grover Williams demonstrated the full extent of his fieldcraft. He moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice. He used multiple cover identities, switching between them to confuse surveillance. He met contacts only in public spaces where surveillance was difficult: parks, markets, churches during services. He became, as one SOE report noted, functionally invisible. The Germans knew he existed. They had descriptions, photographs from before the war, even fingerprints from his racing career. But they couldn't find him. Kiefer later wrote in his operational diary, "The English racing driver represents a significant failure in our security apparatus. We know his methods, his associates, his movements, and yet he operates with impunity. This suggests either extraordinary luck or a level of professional skill we have not previously encountered in terrorist operations. What Kiefer didn't understand was it wasn't luck or superhuman skill. It was discipline. The absolute refusal to deviate from security protocols, no matter how tedious or inconvenient. Grover Williams never made the same mistake twice. He learned from every close call. And most importantly, he understood that the Germans were looking for a spy, someone sneaking around, acting suspicious, nervous. So he did the opposite. He acted normal, bored even. Just another French civilian enduring the occupation. In August 1943, Grover Williams re-established radio contact with London. His message was brief and characteristically understated. Network intact. Continuing operations. Require resupply. SOE authorized an RAF drop for September 2, 1943. Weapons, explosives, medical supplies, and emergency funds to support continued operations. The drop went perfectly. Grover Williams recovered the containers, distributed the supplies to his network, and prepared for what he believed would be the final phase of the war, supporting the Allied invasion when it came. He couldn't have known that his network had been penetrated again. A collaborator named Henri Lafont, a French gangster turned Gestapo informant, had infiltrated the Paris resistance through a series of brutal tactics. Lafont's method was simple: identify resistance members, kidnap their families, and force cooperation. It was thuggery masquerading as counterintelligence, and it was devastatingly effective. Through Lafont's information, the Gestapo learned that a major meeting of resistance leaders was planned on October 10, 1943, at a farmhouse outside Saint-Nazaire. Grover Williams would be there, coordinating with resistance commanders to plan sabotage operations against the Atlantic Wall fortifications. Kiefer saw his opportunity. The farmhouse was isolated, surrounded by fields, a perfect location for a meeting, which meant it was also a perfect location for a trap. Kiefer positioned 3 teams of SD operatives in the surrounding area, equipped with automatic weapons and orders to capture, not kill. He wanted the network's leadership alive for interrogation. The meeting began at 2 p.m. on a gray October afternoon. 11 resistance leaders gathered in the farmhouse's kitchen, spreading maps across the table, discussing targets, timing, and coordination with London. Grover Williams was there, along with Robert Benoit and 3 other SOE-trained operatives. At 3:17 p.m., one of the resistance fighters posted as a lookout saw German vehicles approaching on the access road. He shouted a warning. In the farmhouse, men grabbed weapons and scattered, heading for pre-planned escape routes. Grover Williams made it 20 meters before SD operatives emerged from concealment in the tree line. He reached for the pistol in his jacket, a Browning HP-35 that SOE had provided, loaded with 9 rounds. But 3 German soldiers already had weapons trained on him.
Hände hoch. Sofort. For the first time in 4 years of operational work, Grover Williams had run out of options. He raised his hands. The war, for him, had just ended. Kiefer's men captured 6 resistance members that day, including Grover Williams and Benoit. It was one of the Gestapo's most significant counterintelligence successes in France, the capture of SOE's most effective long-term network leadership. But even in capture, Grover Williams was thinking tactically. During the transport to Paris, he said nothing, revealed nothing, gave the Germans no leverage for their interrogations. He knew the protocols. Resist for 48 hours, long enough for his network to realize he'd been captured, and implement security protocols. After that, it didn't matter what he told them. The network would have already adapted. Kiefer interrogated Grover Williams personally. The sessions began with courtesy, an acknowledgement of his courage, an appeal to end the war with dignity. When that failed, the interrogations became harsher. Sleep deprivation, isolation, threats against anyone he might care about. Grover Williams revealed nothing of operational value. The transcripts of these interrogations, preserved in captured Gestapo records, show a remarkable psychological battle. Kiefer, one of the most skilled interrogators in German intelligence, versus a man who'd spent 4 years operating undercover, with every interaction a form of interrogation in reverse. Kiefer: "We know everything already. The frequencies, the safe houses, the contacts in London. Your cooperation now is merely a formality." Grover Williams: "Then you don't need me to confirm it." Kiefer: "We could make this much easier for you." Grover Williams: "I'm quite comfortable, thank you." It's a masterclass in resistance. He gave them his name. They already knew it. He confirmed he was British, obvious from his accent. Beyond that, nothing. No operational details, no network contacts, no radio procedures. After 2 weeks, Kiefer noted in his report, "Subject maintains operational security despite enhanced interrogation. Recommend transfer to concentration camp system for long-term detention." Grover Williams was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp in November 1943, along with several other captured SOE agents. He survived there for over a year under conditions that killed thousands of other prisoners. Starvation rations, forced labor, arbitrary violence from guards, disease. In March 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Germany, the SS began liquidating prisoners who could testify about war crimes. Grover Williams was executed by firing squad on March 23, 1945, less than 6 weeks before Germany's surrender. The tragedy of William Grover Williams' death is compounded by this fact. The intelligence network he built continued operating until the end of the war. The Germans captured him, but they never completely dismantled Chestnut. The cell structure he'd designed held. When one section was compromised, it didn't bring down the rest. His security protocols, paranoid, tedious, exhausting, saved dozens of lives. After the war, Allied intelligence officers assessed his contribution. The reports, now declassified, are remarkable. Agent Sebastian, Grover Williams, established and maintained one of SOE's most productive networks in occupied France, operating continuously from May 1941 to October 1943. His intelligence contributions directly supported Operation Overlord planning, particularly regarding German troop dispositions, coastal defenses, and rail infrastructure. His sabotage operations delayed German reinforcement movements during the Normandy campaign by an estimated 48 to 72 hours across multiple divisions, a tactical delay that likely saved hundreds of Allied lives during the critical D-Day period. The strategic assessment is even strikinger. Grover Williams' greatest achievement wasn't any single operation or piece of intelligence. It was demonstrating that long-term deep cover operations in occupied territory were possible. Before Chestnut, SOE had struggled with rapid agent attrition. Networks were being rolled up in months or weeks. Grover Williams proved that with proper tradecraft, an agent could operate indefinitely behind enemy lines. His methods, living openly, using real cover, and maintaining absolute discipline, and treating every interaction as potentially dangerous, became the template for later SOE operations. The racing drivers he recruited, Benoit, Wimille, and others, used the same techniques. Several survived the war and continued working in intelligence during the Cold War. Perhaps the most fascinating documents in the Grover Williams archive are the post-capture Gestapo assessments. Kiefer and his analysts spent considerable time trying to understand how an Allied agent had operated in Paris for over 2 years without detection. Their conclusions, written in dry German intelligence, read like grudging admiration. The subject's operational security was exceptional. He avoided all typical agent behaviors. No suspicious meetings, no apparent nervousness, no attempts to avoid German personnel. On the contrary, he socialized openly and maintained friendly relations with occupation authorities, using these relationships for intelligence gathering.
This represents a sophisticated understanding of cover mechanics that we have not previously encountered in terrorist operations.
What frustrated the Germans most was the realization that they'd been close to Grover Williams dozens of times without knowing it. He'd attended social functions where Gestapo officers were present. He'd been stopped at checkpoints and waved through. In one particularly galling incident, documented in Kiefer's diary, Grover Williams had been in a Paris restaurant in July 1942 when Kiefer himself was dining 3 tables away. The two men had never met, but Kiefer later realized he'd been within meters of the agent he'd been hunting for over a year. The German failure wasn't tactical. They had the resources, the manpower, and the expertise to catch Allied agents. The failure was conceptual. They were looking for someone who looked like a spy. Grover Williams didn't. He looked like what he was, a racing driver stuck in occupied Paris, making the best of a bad situation. The cover was effective because it was almost entirely true. Modern intelligence agencies study this case in their training programs. It's a textbook example of what they call organic cover, a legend so close to reality that it's nearly impossible to break through interrogation or investigation. What made William Grover Williams successful wasn't physical courage, though he had that, or technical skill with explosives and radios, though he had that too. What made him successful was something harder to quantify, the ability to endure psychological stress that would break most people. Modern intelligence agencies screen for this now. They have psychological assessments, stress tests, controlled simulations that try to identify candidates who can maintain cover under pressure. In 1940, SOE was making educated guesses based on instinct and circumstantial evidence. They guessed right with Grover Williams. But there was a cost. The post-war debriefings of surviving agents from his network revealed that Grover Williams had been profoundly changed by his experience. Robert Benoit, who survived Buchenwald concentration camp and reunited with other network members after liberation, reported, "Williams was never the same after the war started. The man who'd been so alive, so present, you could see him withdrawing into himself. Not depression, exactly. More like he'd learned to live in his own head, and after years of that, he couldn't quite come all the way back out." This is the hidden cost of deep cover work. The psychological compartmentalization that makes you effective also isolates you from normal human connection. You become so accustomed to performing that authenticity becomes impossible. Every relationship is transactional. Every conversation is assessed for security risks. Trust becomes a tactical calculation rather than an emotional reality. Grover Williams never came back from that isolation because he never got the chance. He was captured before the war ended, held in brutal conditions for a year and a half, and executed just weeks before liberation. There was no decompression, no psychological support, no chance to reintegrate into normal life. The tragedy isn't just that he died. It's that the man who'd walked through occupied Paris for 4 years, invisible among enemies, never got to be visible again as himself. The rain still falls on the Rue de la Pompe in Paris. The building that once housed Gestapo headquarters is now an apartment complex. The 5th-floor apartment where Grover Williams watched and waited is occupied by a family that knows nothing of what happened there 80 decades ago. But in the archives of SOE successor organizations, in the training materials used by modern intelligence services, in the case studies taught at Fort Monkley and Hendon and every other facility where spies are made, William Grover Williams remains present. Not as a ghost, but as a standard. The proof that one person, with nothing more than discipline and nerve and absolute commitment to the mission, can operate in the heart of enemy territory and remain invisible until the moment of their choosing. He was never caught. Until he was. But by then, it didn't matter. The intelligence had been sent. The network had survived. The mission was complete. And that, in the end, is what espionage is actually about. Not about never getting caught. Everyone gets caught eventually if they operate long enough. It's about remaining operational long enough that catching you becomes strategically irrelevant. William Grover Williams understood that. He lived it. And he died knowing that while they'd captured his body, they'd never compromised his mission. In the terrible arithmetic of intelligence work, that counts as victory.
William Grover Williams, the racing driver who became one of Britain's most effective spies, walked openly among the enemy, invisible yet deadly. He was never caught until the very end. But by then, his mission was complete and his network survived. If you loved this story, like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more incredible true stories from history.